In November of 2017, the world watched as Air Force One touched down in Beijing. What came next was a spectacle of diplomacy unlike any other. The Chinese government rolled out a reception so lavish, so meticulously planned, it was dubbed a State Visit Plus. The American president was hosted for a private dinner inside the Forbidden City, an exceptionally rare honor for a foreign leader, meant to signal a new era of cooperation between two global titans. They watched Peking opera, toured ancient palaces, and toasted to a future of mutual prosperity. President Trump praised his counterpart Xi Jinping as a very special man, while President Xi spoke of a blueprint for the future, agreeing the two nations should be partners, not rivals. On the surface, it was a summit of almost unbelievable goodwill, but beneath the gilded veneer of ceremony and flattery, the tectonic plates of global power were grinding against each other. This visit wasn't the beginning of a lasting friendship. Instead, it was the final quiet moment before the storm. It was the prelude to a trade war that would reshape the global economy, the opening act of a tech rivalry that would define a new generation, and a critical turning point for the flashpoints that still dominate our headlines today, from the Taiwan Strait to the global supply chain. To understand why the relationship between Washington and Beijing is what it is today, this complex and perilous dance of competition and wary coexistence, we have to go back to that visit. We have to look past the pageantry and figure out the real reasons Donald Trump went to China, what both sides truly wanted, and why all those grand promises of partnership seemed to evaporate almost as soon as he left. This wasn't just another diplomatic trip, it was a high-stakes negotiation, and its fallout is still shaping our world in profound ways. So why did that visit happen? And why, all these years later, does it matter more than ever? The central paradox of the 2017 summit is the total disconnect between how it looked and what actually happened next. On one hand, you had the announcement of over $250 billion in business deals, a staggering figure meant to broadcast a balanced, thriving economic partnership. On the other hand, just a few months later, the United States launched the opening shots of a trade war, slapping sweeping tariffs on Chinese goods and triggering a tit-for-tat retaliation that sent shockwaves through global markets. How could a relationship seemingly cemented by $250 billion in deals crumble so quickly? The answer gets to the fundamental truth of that moment. The visit was less about real agreement and more about strategic posturing. It was a masterclass in geopolitical theater, where both leaders played their parts for audiences at home and abroad, all while the real conflicts over trade, tech, and security were left to fester just below the surface. The deals were the headline, but the real story was in the fine print and in what was left unsaid. To really get the significance of the 2017 visit, you have to see it as two different events happening at the same time. There was the summit for the cameras, and then there was the summit behind closed doors. The first was a PR triumph, the second was a quiet reminder of just how far apart the two sides really were. First, the spectacle. China's State Visit Plus was a deliberate and masterfully executed strategy. Beijing knew the American president appreciated grandeur and responded to personal flattery. The entire visit was tailored to him. Hosting President Trump and the First Lady for a private dinner in the Forbidden City, the ancient home of Chinese emperors, was a gesture of immense symbolic weight, an honor state media called exceptional and rare. This wasn't just a meal, it was a message. It was designed to show respect, to put the American leader on a pedestal, and to build a personal rapport with President Xi. The pageantry continued with a magnificent military honor guard at the Great Hall of the People and a lavish state banquet. President Xi quoted Chinese proverbs about friendship. President Trump praised his host's strength. For Beijing, this was crisis management through ceremony. The goal was to use personal chemistry and big displays of respect to smooth over the deep economic grievances the Trump administration had been talking about for months. It was an attempt to manage a potentially volatile president by appealing to his ego, hoping a strong personal relationship at the top could stop the whole thing from spiraling into open hostility. In his public remarks, Trump called the welcome magnificent. On the surface, the Chinese strategy seemed to be working perfectly. The optics were great, the tone was friendly. But then there was the other summit, the one about substance. The centerpiece here was the announcement of over $250 billion in deals between American and Chinese companies, covering everything from energy and aviation to agriculture. The list included a pledge for China to buy 300 Boeing aircraft and a massive $43 billion joint project for natural gas in Alaska, presented to the world as a huge win for Trump's America First agenda. This massive figure was meant to show he could deliver. But as analysts started digging into the details, the reality turned out to be a lot less transformative. Many of the so-called deals were actually non-binding memorandums of understanding, MOUs, not firm contracts. Some were for projects already in the works, and others were for purchases Chinese firms would have likely made anyway. They were just bundled together for a dramatic announcement. For instance, the massive Alaska gas project was a joint development agreement, not a final decision to invest, and it ultimately went nowhere. The Boeing orders were a mix of new and existing orders, standard practice during state visits. It was a common diplomatic tactic, a way for both sides to claim a political win. For President Trump, it let him go home and say he'd secured a historic victory. For President Xi, it was a low-cost way to ease American pressure on trade, showing a willingness to buy more U.S. goods. Without committing to the painful structural economic reforms Washington was really demanding, things like stopping intellectual property theft, ending forced technology transfers, and cutting subsidies to Chinese companies. In his public statements in Beijing, Trump did mention the trade imbalance, calling it one-sided and unfair, but he notably softened the blame, saying he didn't fault China for taking advantage of the U.S. in the past. This reflected the dual nature of the trip: publicly project a friendly relationship with Xi, while signaling to his base back home that he was still fighting for them. But the fundamental disagreements weren't resolved. They were just papered over with $250 billion worth of aspirational agreements. The goodwill was a mile wide and an inch deep, and as events would soon prove, the relationship was far more fragile than the grand ceremony in the Forbidden City suggested. The warm glow of the Beijing summit faded fast. The handshakes and toasts of November 2017 gave way to the harsh reality of economic conflict in early 2018. The unresolved tensions, so skillfully masked by diplomatic pageantry, erupted into the open, first as a trade war and then as a broader tech rivalry. The aftermath proved that personal chemistry between leaders can't bridge a fundamental gap in national interests. The first and most dramatic shift was the trade war. Having campaigned on getting tough with China, the Trump administration felt the polite diplomacy and non-binding deals from Beijing hadn't produced any real change. The core complaints were all still there: a massive trade deficit, IP theft, and a market that was still tough for American companies to crack. The opening shot was fired in early 2018 with tariffs on solar panels and washing machines. That was followed in March by tariffs on steel and aluminum. Beijing shot back in April with its own tariffs on U.S. products like pork and fruit, but these were just the preliminary skirmishes. The war began in earnest on July 6, 2018. When the U.S. imposed a 25% tariff on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods. The list targeted items related to China's Made in China 2025 industrial plan, like robotics and aerospace parts. China's response was immediate and symmetrical, hitting $34 billion of U.S. goods, with a heavy focus on agricultural products like soybeans, a move designed to inflict maximum political pain on Trump's rural base. From there, the conflict just escalated. By the end of the cycle, the U.S. had tariffs on roughly half of everything it imported from China, and Beijing had retaliated on the vast majority of what it bought from the U.S. The era of engagement was over. It was now an era of economic confrontation. That $250 billion in deals from 2017 seemed like a distant, almost naive memory. Parallel to the trade war, a second, arguably more important conflict was taking shape: the technology war. The Trump administration came to see China's tech ambitions not just as an economic challenge, but as a direct threat to American national security. And this fear crystallized around one company: Huawei. U.S. intelligence agencies had long worried that Huawei, the world's largest telecom equipment maker, had close ties to the Chinese government and its gear could be used for spying. These concerns had been simmering for years, but they boiled over during the trade war. In August 2018, a new law banned U.S. government agencies from using equipment from Huawei and another Chinese tech firm, ZTE. While U.S. security concerns about these companies weren't new, this was a dramatic escalation. The pressure cranked up in May 2019, when the administration placed Huawei on the Entity List. This move effectively blacklisted the company, requiring American firms to get a special license to sell it technology. It was a devastating blow, cutting off Huawei's access to critical U.S. tech, most famously Google's official Android operating system and its ecosystem of apps. Huawei could still use the open-source version of Android, but losing the Google Play Store and other services was a massive hit for its global smartphone business. The fight over Huawei was a watershed moment. It signaled the competition was no longer just about trade deficits. It was about who would control the foundational technologies of the 21st century, especially 5G. The U.S. launched a global campaign to persuade its allies to ban Huawei from their own 5G networks, framing it as a choice between a trusted U.S.-led ecosystem and a risky Chinese-dominated one. The tech war was, in many ways, a more profound conflict than the tariff battle. The goodwill of the 2017 summit was built on the hope that economic partnership could overcome strategic rivalry. The aftermath proved the opposite. Strategic rivalry would ultimately trump and even weaponize economic ties. The conflicts that blew up after the 2017 visit didn't just disappear. They set the stage for the geopolitical landscape we live in today. To understand why that visit still matters, we need to look at how these core issues have evolved and why they remain so critical. First up is Taiwan. For decades, the U.S. has maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity, acknowledging Beijing's One China principle while also helping Taiwan defend itself and being deliberately vague about whether the U.S. military would step in during an attack. It's a policy meant to keep everyone guessing and maintain the peace. The Trump era tossed a new level of unpredictability into this delicate balance. His administration approved major arms sales to Taiwan, but his transactional rhetoric sometimes made allies nervous about the reliability of U.S. commitments. Today, under the Biden administration, Taiwan has become even more central to the U.S. China rivalry. While strategic ambiguity is still the official policy, the tone has hardened. President Biden has repeatedly said the U.S. would come to Taiwan's defense, even as the White House walks the comments back to stick to the official line. The U.S. military has ramped up its presence in the region, and arms sales have continued and even accelerated. In response, China has massively increased its military pressure with near-daily air and naval patrols around the island. The Taiwan Strait is now widely seen as the most dangerous flashpoint in the world, where one wrong move could lead to a direct conflict between two nuclear powers. The fragile status quo that the 2017 visit tried to preserve has been replaced by a state of constant tension. Next is the tangled web connecting China and the Middle East, specifically through Iran. When the Trump administration pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal and launched its maximum pressure campaign of sanctions, China became Iran's most important economic lifeline. As Western companies fled, Beijing stepped in. According to most independent tracking estimates, China became the largest buyer of Iranian oil, often purchased at a steep discount and transported via a shadow fleet of tankers to evade U.S. sanctions. This trade has provided Tehran with what analysts estimate to be tens of billions of dollars in revenue, blunting the impact of U.S. pressure. In 2021, the two countries signed a 25-year strategic partnership to formalize their economic and security cooperation. This matters now more than ever. It means U.S. policy toward Iran is tangled up with its policy toward China. Washington can't exert maximum pressure on Tehran if Beijing is willing to be its sanctions-busting partner. It has also boosted China's diplomatic influence in a region long dominated by the U.S. This dynamic, where an energy-hungry China props up a U.S. adversary, has become a structural feature of global politics. Finally, there's the battle over supply chains, epitomized by rare earth elements. These 17 minerals are essential ingredients in everything from iPhones and electric cars to advanced weapons like Javelin missiles and F-35 fighter jets. And in this critical sector, China is overwhelmingly dominant. While China mines a lot of the world's rare earths, its real power is in processing. It controls around 90% of the global capacity for refining these elements into usable materials. The trade war brought the strategic danger of this dependence into sharp focus. The fear was, and still is, that in a conflict, China could cut off the supply, crippling Western high-tech and defense industries. That concern has only grown. The U.S. and its allies are now scrambling to build their own mining and processing capabilities, but it's a slow, expensive process that will take years. And this is the new playbook, the weaponization of supply chains. It's not just rare earths, it's semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and batteries. The 2017 visit, with its focus on selling more stuff to China, feels like it belongs to a different century. The conversation now is all about de-risking and friendshoring, moving critical production away from China and toward trusted partners. The realization that economic interdependence could be a weakness, not just a strength, is one of the most profound consequences of the breakdown that followed Trump's trip to Beijing. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Trump administration's shift on China isn't a single policy, but a whole new political consensus in Washington. For decades, both Democrats and Republicans believed that engaging with China economically would eventually lead it to become a responsible stakeholder in the global system. The Trump era shattered that assumption. By launching the trade war and confronting China on tech and security, the Trump administration completely changed the conversation. The idea that China was a strategic competitor, not just a trading partner, moved from the fringes to the mainstream. And this shift has proven to be remarkably durable, creating a rare point of bipartisan agreement in a deeply divided Washington. Today, Republicans and Democrats may disagree on the tactics, but they broadly share the diagnosis. China is the most significant long-term challenge to the United States. That's why, when the Biden administration took office, it didn't reverse course. Instead, it built on the foundation it inherited. The style changed, but the competitive substance remained. The Biden team kept the Trump-era tariffs, arguing they provided leverage, while shifting the primary focus even more explicitly toward technology. This approach has been famously described by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan as small yard, high fence. The idea is to define a small yard around a narrow set of foundational technologies like advanced semiconductors, AI, and quantum computing, and build a high fence of export controls and other restrictions around it to keep China out. Outside that yard, normal commercial trade can continue. This strategy is a direct evolution of the tech war that began under Trump. The Biden administration has used the same tools and introduced even more powerful ones, like the sweeping export controls in October 2022, designed to cut China off from advanced chip technology. But the small yard, high fence idea is proving tricky in practice. The yard seems to keep expanding as more technologies are deemed critical, blurring the line between targeted security measures and broader economic decoupling. This brings us to where we are now. The U.S. China relationship is defined by managed but persistent competition. The era of optimistic engagement that peaked with the pageantry of 2017 is over. It's been replaced by a new reality where national security concerns consistently trump purely economic ones. High-level meetings still happen, but their purpose has changed. It's not about building a partnership anymore. It's about setting up guardrails to keep competition from spiraling into conflict. The issues at the heart of the rivalry are the very ones that erupted after the 2017 summit: trade, technology, supply chains, and military flashpoints like the Taiwan Strait. That trip to Beijing matters now because it was the moment the old paradigm died. It was the last time leaders could plausibly stand together and talk about a shared blueprint for the future. Everything that followed, the tariffs, the tech bans, the heightened tensions, has flowed from the failure of that vision and the rise of this new, much more confrontational reality. We are all living in the world that was born from the ashes of that spectacular but ultimately hollow State Visit Plus. The U.S. China relationship will undoubtedly continue to shape the 21st century. The path from cooperation to competition has been rapid and transformative, but the future isn't set in stone. What do you think comes next? Can the small yard, high fence strategy work without crippling the global economy? Or is a broader economic separation inevitable? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. So in the end, Donald Trump's 2017 visit to China stands as a pivotal moment, just not for the reasons everyone talked about at the time. It wasn't a masterstroke of deal-making, nor was it the dawn of a new era of cooperation. Instead, it was a grand and final performance of a diplomatic script that was already obsolete. It was a monument to an age of engagement that was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The visit's true significance is what it revealed about power and the limits of personal diplomacy. The spectacle of the Forbidden City dinner and the $250 billion deal announcement created a powerful illusion of progress. But this illusion couldn't hide the deep structural conflicts over economic models, tech supremacy, and national security that were already pulling the two countries apart. The visit wasn't a solution. It was a diagnostic. It proved that no amount of ceremony could fix the fundamental divergence of interests between a rising power and an established one. Why does it matter now? Because the fallout from that visit defines the world we're in today. The trade war it preceded set a new normal of economic friction. The tech war it unleashed is pushing the digital world toward bifurcation and turning supply chains into battlegrounds. And the unresolved tensions over places like Taiwan have only grown more dangerous, casting a long shadow over the entire globe. The story of Trump's visit to China is the story of how quickly the ground can shift under our feet. It marks the moment when the old consensus on China finally fractured, giving way to a new reality of strategic competition. It was a visit framed by the language of partnership, but its lasting legacy is one of rivalry. It was the last beautiful gilded chapter of an old story right before a new, much more uncertain one began.